A special meeting of the Northampton School Committee. Today is Tuesday, March 14th. This meeting is being held on Zoom pursuant to the modification of the state's open meeting law. And all that are participating on Zoom will be audio and video recorded. This is a special meeting, so there is no public comment. And Annie, will you please call the roll?
Mayor Shara?
Present.
Member Robbins?
Present.
Member Gazy, you just made it in.
Present.
Thank you. Member Seraphy Cox?
Present.
Member Stein?
Present.
Member Levy?
Present.
Member Goldman?
Present.
And Member Davis?
Present.
Quorum.
Great, thank you. Okay, so the item on our agenda tonight is a presentation on inclusive hiring practices by Member Levy. So I'm going to hand it over to you. Thank you so much for doing this, Member Levy.
All right, thank you. Thanks for making the time for this. I'm excited to be able to share with you the presentation that I shared with the subcommittee that I hope will also serve us for tomorrow when we create our rubric and will help guide us in the process. And I also just want to do a quick check-in with thumbs up, thumbs down. I was going to shorten this slightly. This presentation doesn't cover everything. When I give this presentation, generally, I talk about the process from start to finish, including the writing of the posting or the job description, how we think about networking and posting, as well as how we screen candidates. So read cover letters, resumes. I've taken out the part about writing the job description and the posting because for our purposes, that's done. I was also going to take out the part about screening because we've already had a committee screen our candidates and we're just really interviewing. However, I'm wondering if I should keep, it's really like 4 minutes, 5 minutes, because we are still reading the materials of the candidates we have. And also, I just hope that this is a process that as a district will be implementing. So give me a thumbs up if, yeah, let's keep in the part about screening. Thumbs down means nope, let's make it 4 to 5 minutes shorter and just go straight to interviewing when we get to that part. Okay, awesome. Thank you. All right, so I'm going to share my screen. There seems to be a lot of singing happening in the room next door, and I hope you don't hear that. Sorry if you do. So what I want to do tonight is share with you practices for inclusive hiring that are really to help us mitigate bias. So what we're going to do is really spend a lot of time talking about bias. So the first part of our conversation will be understanding bias as it operates and also understanding bias as it is implicated within the search process. We will talk a little bit about why diversity matters, but that part I'm really going to skip over because I think we're all there. We'll then talk about sort of 2 different things. So one is if we have an understanding of bias and how it impacts hiring, then we need to do 2 things. One is we need to design a process that through its very design mitigates bias to the greatest extent possible. And then we need to know what do we need to do in order to raise our own awareness about our own biases so that we can be more prepared to lessen their impact in our decision making. You'll see discussion is relegated to the very last bullet here, but that's not my intention. I hope you will ask lots and lots of questions as they arise for you. So please don't feel like you need to hold questions till the end. Questions before we jump in. All right, so this first part is participatory. I'm going to ask you to unmute yourselves, please. And I'm going to show you a picture. And when I show you this picture, I want you to tell me which square looks darker to you, the square with the letter A on it or the square with the letter B. So in a moment, you're going to see a picture and I want you to just shout out A or B. So what looks darker, the square with the letter A or the square with the letter B? You do have to be unmuted for this to work. Okay, thank you. I see folks unmuting themselves if you can. Thank you very much. Okay, so which looks darker, the square with the letter A or the square with the letter B?
A.
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 Okay,
What's darker? Are the letter or the square itself?
the square.
Oh,
The square is
A.
A.
Okay, great. I heard lots of A's and I heard one B. Thank you very much. You can mute yourselves again. Although I'm going to ask you to unmute yourselves again in just a moment. So that's typically what happens when we show this picture. We usually get a lot of A's. Every now and then we get a B. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to remove the shadow that's being cast by that green cylinder, and I'm going to draw a line between the A and the B. And here's what we're going to see. Those squares are actually the same shade of gray. So let's go back and let's talk about what happened, or what typically happens that usually leads most of us to say A and a few folks to say B. First thing that happens is we see a pattern. We see light, dark, light. We see this object that gets in our way. We see dark, light, dark. We don't even have to look at the whole thing. We just see little bits of this and we say to ourselves, oh, I know what that is. That's a chessboard, or that's a checkers board. I know how that works. And because it's a pattern we recognize and we've seen before, in order for it to make sense to us, usually we will say the square with the letter A is darker because that's what fits into the pattern that most of us are used to. So we're seeing a pattern and we're sort of filling it in really quickly. Another thing happens, we see this green cylinder, we see that it's casting a shadow, and many of us say to ourselves, oh, I know how that works. I've seen shadows before, and we're feeling really good about ourselves. We know that shadows make things appear darker than they actually are. And so we lighten the square with the letter B on it in our mind's eye in order to compensate for that shadow. Frequently, when people are saying B, what they're doing is they're going the opposite direction. So they're compensating in the opposite direction and actually darkening the square with the letter B because of that shadow. But most of us are lightening it because of the shadow. And then there's another thing that's happening here. And we're saying, okay, the letter A is written in a light color font. The letter B is written in a dark color font. And from our experiences, we know light color fonts show up better on dark backgrounds. Dark color fonts show up better on light backgrounds. And then there's another thing that's happening here. And that is that I phrased this question in a binary. I didn't give you this fun open-ended question to say like, hey, what's going on here? To let you say, well, let's see, there's a shadow, I see a pattern. Instead, I said, which is darker? And in framing it as which is darker, that leads us to believe that there's one square that's going to be darker than the other. And it doesn't give us even the opportunity to pause and say, well, wait a second, is one of them necessarily darker? And here's the thing, this happens in a split second. You looked at this picture and you said A or you said B in a heartbeat. So we went through all of those thought processes very, very quickly in order to get us to an answer. Okay, we're going to do this again. I'm going to show you another picture. This time, I'm going to ask you not what do you see, but what do you feel? So in a moment, actually right now, unmute yourselves, please. And don't be polite. When you see the picture, I want you to just shout out. I'm going to wait till okay, great. Everybody's unmuted. All right, what do you feel when you look at this picture?
Angry.
Yeah.
oops.
Annoyed.
Annoyed.
Humorous.
Yeah, it gets funny.
Okay, thank you. You can mute yourselves again, or you can stay unmuted because you don't have to actually mute yourselves. So thank you very much. You're all, some of you, a little bit kinder folks than I am. I feel nothing but rage when I look at this picture. And I will say that I've seen this picture like 100 times. And today in this moment, I feel the same rage that I did the very first time I looked at this picture. And I'm going to give you a little bit of context for my rage. When I work in a building that actually I'm very lucky. There are people who go to work at Amherst College who can't park anywhere near their office. I have two options. In front of my office building, there's a road and you can park along the road. And then at the bottom of my building is a parking lot and I can park in either of those. There are people who wear Fitbits because they want to maximize their steps and get the most steps in their days. I'm the opposite of that person. I want to park my car as close to my office as I can so that I can take the fewest steps possible. And I've learned that if I park along that road in front of the building, that because of where my office is, that gets me to my office with the fewest steps. However, sometimes I show up to work a little bit later than I intended, and all of the parking spots along the road are taken, but they're not marked off with white lines. People just park. And what I do is I mentally calculate how many more cars might have fit along the road if people had parked properly, as opposed to leaving enough space for like 2/3 of a car to park, but not an entire car to park. And so that is the context that I bring. I get very angry when I feel like people are not maximizing parking spaces. I also look at this car and I see a big gas guzzling SUV, no judgment, no worries if you drive a big gas guzzling SUV. But I look at it and I say, you are taking up a lot of environmental space. Why are you also taking up a lot of parking space? That is me and the context I bring. I have a friend and colleague who looks at this picture and says, oh, well, that's just me. And all I can think is, kids, get out of the car. I don't have the mental capacity to figure out, did I park between the lines? I have another friend and colleague who looks at this picture and says, oh my gosh, I hope everything's okay. And that's when I feel like, oh gosh, I'm a horrible person. But here's our reality. Context matters. And the context that we bring because of our own lives and our own experiences shapes the way we see things. It shapes the way we respond and even our emotional reactions. Think about, so when I look at this license plate, I'm guessing that it's Pennsylvania. Think about how you might feel if you looked at this and you saw New York or New Jersey or Maine or Iowa, and whether you might have a different reaction given the license plate. So here are the things I want us to know and understand based on these last few minutes. Number one, we process over 110 millions of pieces of information every minute. I'm gonna say that again, because that's a staggering piece of knowledge here. We process over 110 millions of pieces of information every minute. We are only able to consciously process 2% of that information. 98% of what we're doing is subconscious, right? We see a picture, we've seen the pattern, we see the shadow, and we're making sense of it. I can be focused in on you and not terrified that this thing over my shoulder is going to come and attack me at any minute. I don't even have to look at it directly. I can see the shapes and I say to myself, that is a fan. I've encountered fans before. I know that I am safe. And the I'm safe part is what allows me to focus in on you and not like turning over my shoulder every other second. And I'm not consciously telling myself that. That's information I'm processing subconsciously. And then not only are we making sense of the world, but we're having emotional reactions. And these are informing then the ways that we're making sense of what's in front of us. And then lastly, our context matters. So our identities, our experiences, our background shapes the way we view and process the information we have. And that's really what bias is. Bias is making sense of the world, relying on some shortcuts that we've developed over time so that we don't need a nap every 2 hours. Some of us feel like we need naps every 2 hours regardless. There are over 150 different documented forms of bias. You don't need to know what all of them are on this list, but I want to talk about a few that impact the hiring process, because again, understanding bias can help us so that when folks say you're biased, hopefully they'll say it kinder. We can be like, yeah, I am, because that's normal and that's natural. So let's talk about a few different forms of bias as they exist and how they might relate to the hiring process so that, again, we can be on the lookout and we can also implement some strategies to lessen their impact. This is an image that a lot of people have seen before. Raise your hand if you've never seen this image before. Everybody's seen it. Okay. Who wants to describe one of the people that they can see in this image?
My daughter says that she's never seen it before. So if you want a fresh.
Awesome. Metzli, will you participate with us for a hot minute? Do you see a person in this image? Can you describe the features of the person, like their nose, where they're looking, their chin, things like that?
They're looking away and they have a really small nose.
Uh-huh.
They have sort of like a big round chin.
Uh-huh. Is this their chin right here?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And they have like a black, like puffy jacket, I guess.
And
And-
what's this thing right here?
Like a necklace around their neck, I guess.
Yeah, like a necklace or maybe the clasp of the bonnet. And then what's this part right here?
Right there.
Uh-oh, you're muted.
Sorry, she said a white patch, maybe like their shirt.
Yeah, this is their shirt, and this might be like the top of their chest, right?
Yeah.
Awesome, Metzley, thank you so much for describing this person. I see that person too. Okay, keep looking, Metzley, because I'm gonna ask somebody to describe another person that they see. Does anybody see another figure when they look at this image? Aileen, who do you see? Can you describe the figure, the features?
Well, just pointing out too that I have seen this before.
Nice.
And I remember vividly the first time I saw it was before I went on an exchange program in high school. So this has been around
Quite some time, yes.
Yeah, but I see an old, I'm going to say an old woman. I think that's the phrase that would be.
Okay. Some people might use, one person used the term bohemian witch in a very loving way to describe. I'm sure witches are like lovely.
Because of the cool hat, but like I still see with the witchy idea would be that this is
Ooh, sorry.
like the nose.
Okay, so this is a big nose here, right?
Yeah.
Okay, what's
And then
this?
that thing that could be seen as a necklace is like a skinny mouth,
Uh-huh, and what's this right here?
like a super pointy chin.
And what's this right here?
Like an eye, I was thinking.
And is this like maybe a little wart on this person's nose?
Yeah.
All right. Metzley, can you see this person?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Isn't that weird?
So usually if we look at this image long enough, we can see both these people. But here's the thing with anchoring bias. One of these images is either the one you saw first, the first time you saw it, or it's the one that just struck you the most for some reason at some point in your life. Maybe you have an association with it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave this image right now. When we come back to this image, that person, the one you saw first, or the one that made the strongest impression, is who you are always going to see first every time you look at this image. You can train yourself to see the other person, but it takes effort. And here's the reality. In our day-to-day lives, when we're not looking at a photo like this, we don't tend to put forth as much effort to see somebody in a different light after we've already come to a conclusion about how we see them. And that's what anchoring bias is. It basically says once we've developed a first impression, it's really hard to overcome it. So for us, as we are thinking about how we're evaluating candidates, the longer we can defer judgment, the longer we can wait to really come to an idea of or an understanding of what we think about somebody, the more open we are to actually see them in multiple ways or to get a fuller picture of them. So that's anchoring bias. Confirmation bias is kind of similar to anchoring bias in that it's about sort of delaying judgment as long as we can. Confirmation bias basically says, okay, one person's going to say, here are the facts, what conclusions can we draw from them? Another person says, I've already come to my conclusion. Now, what facts can I find that support that conclusion? And those facts make us feel really good about ourselves and the conclusion we've drawn. And if there are facts that don't support that conclusion that we've drawn, we have all sorts of reasons in our head why those facts are not important, why we don't need to pay attention to them. And we, in fact, we disregard them. And so it means, again, we're not getting the fullest picture of somebody. And so with confirmation bias, again, the longer we can delay coming to a conclusion, the more open we'll be to all of the different information that's going to really, in the end, inform a much better conclusion. And then the last piece of bias that I want to talk about tonight is implicit bias. And the reason I want to talk about this is when we're talking about our aim to diversify, to bring in candidates who hold identities or backgrounds that are going to help increase the diversity of our district staff. Implicit bias is frequently the one that's getting in the way when even we have the best intentions to diversify. Implicit bias is basically defining or describing, again, all of these biases are happening beneath our radar, so they're happening unconsciously. And I want to also note that when we're biased, we can be biased positively towards somebody and also negatively against them. A bias basically means we're not neutral. So implicit bias describes when we have feelings or thoughts about somebody, or when we associate stereotypes with them without our conscious knowledge. And one of the things that I want to note here, number one, our biases can be counter to our stated values and beliefs. So I can say and truly believe I care about diversity. I want to increase the diversity of our staff. And then my biases are actually at play, working against me beneath my radar. And the other thing I want to note is there's a tricky relationship between bias and identity. And if this was like a 3-hour workshop, we would pause here and do some work on identity to think about how identity informs bias. But one of the things that I really want to point out is we can be biased against people who hold our same identities. Just because we hold a particular identity, it doesn't mean that we're safe from our biases impacting us, because bias is really not just about what we think and believe. It's about what are the stereotypes, what are the messages that are floating around out there that we've been exposed to, whether we believe them or not, but that are informing the ways that we respond. So I'm going to share a video with you to just get us thinking a little bit about how this might impact us in the hiring process. Oh, I didn't click a button when I shared my screen that said I also wanted to share my sound. So I'm gonna do that right now so that you can also hear. Okay, let's try it again.
The monkey business illusion. Count how many times the players wearing white pass the ball. The correct answer is 16 passes. Did you spot the gorilla? For people who haven't seen or heard about a video like this before, about half miss the gorilla. If you knew about the gorilla, you probably saw it, but did you notice the curtain changing color or the player on the black team leaving the game? Let's rewind and watch it again. Here comes the gorilla, and there goes a player, and the curtain is changing from red to gold. When you're looking for a gorilla, you often miss other unexpected events.
Right. There are lots of really fun videos like this on the internet that show us that, like, when we're paying attention to some things, we miss all these other things. I'm pretty sure this is actually a video about bicycle safety. But it just helps us reminds us that we can be really focused in on some things and then miss others. And when we think about folks who have given us feedback, like, how could you not see these particular things in this candidate? Well, if we're looking for something in particular, there might be other things that are absolutely there that we're not seeing. So again, the more we can really think about what is it that we need as a school committee to be on the same page about what we are looking for, so that we are all broadening our awareness as much as possible, the better. And then I know that this is way too many words on the screen. Please don't read them. It's really just to say there's more data out there showing the impact of bias on the hiring process than I have space for on a PowerPoint slide. We know that when participants in a study were shown photographs of different subjects, they were they attributed, when looking on a binary, they claimed that the men were taller than the women, even when A, that wasn't the case, and B, there was something like a doorway or something in the picture that would help give them perspective to be able to measure. And we also know that people who are taller are offered more respect, are offered more jobs, and are actually paid over $160,000 more over the course of their lifetime. In case those of us who are less tall didn't already know that we had an uphill battle anyway. We know through studies that resumes, when word for word and letter for letter were otherwise exactly the same, the resumes that had a Black or African-American sounding name were offered interviews at a far lower rate than the resumes that had a white sounding name. We know that women who demonstrate leadership capacities tend to be seen in a more negative light for those qualities, whereas men, again, when looking at a binary, tend to be seen in a more positive light for those same exact qualities. And then, are you all familiar with the orchestra auditions? In like the 70s and 80s, orchestras were almost entirely made up of men. And then they started asking musicians to audition behind a curtain. And they even asked the musicians to take off their shoes as they were approaching their music stand, so that the judges couldn't guess or try and guess the gender of the musician based on the shoes they were wearing. And all of a sudden, far more women started being hired for professional orchestras. Now, again, like, this is happening subconsciously. I would hope that most people aren't saying, well, obviously men are better musicians than women. Instead, subconsciously, they were being impacted by those biases and making those decisions based on the judgments that were impacting them. So, okay, you're probably saying, Dina, I get it, enough. Bias is a thing, it impacts the hiring process. Okay, so the question is, what do we do about that? So we want to talk about two things. We're going to talk about creating inclusive practices that, through their very design, mitigate bias to the greatest extent possible. And then we're going to talk about, okay, and we can design the best possible process and we still bring ourselves to it. So what do we need to know about our own biases so that we can raise our awareness, lessen their impact? This is the part I'm skipping because we all already know that well-managed diverse teams far outperform well-managed homogeneous teams, right? The well-managed part, I gave a workshop on that too. Come back another time for that. We're not getting there today. But this part is actually really interesting, and I want to pause for just a moment here. The person who did a lot of the research that informs this chart is named Scott Page, who's done a lot of research on the impact of diversity and diverse teams on success rates in organizations. And one of the things Page found in his research is that not only do diverse teams positively impact outcomes, but in the hiring process, if you have a diverse qualified candidate pool, it doesn't matter the identity of the person you hire in the end, that person is going to be better and stronger for the job if you had a diverse qualified pool to begin with. So the diversity of the pool actually raises the quality of the search. Something I think is important as we think about practices, like checking the diversity of the pool along the way. Because if a diverse qualified pool positively impacts the process, we need to somehow be measuring the diversity of the pool. And I'm pretty sure that's not something that we do right now as a district, something I'd love to see us doing. So because it's not something we do, we're not going to really talk about the rest of the content of this slide, but something for us to keep in the back of our minds, that There are ways to legally ask candidates to self-disclose things about their identities that can help our process, not in using that information to make the decision, but in using that information to understand whether we've done enough outreach before it's time to move on. Yeah, so here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna skip the job description, skip the advertising part, and go straight into how we weave DEI into the screening interview process. And one of the things that's hugely important in order to mitigate bias is that we're all on the same page when it comes to understanding what are the skills and abilities that are really important and necessary for somebody to do the job well. That's why tomorrow we're taking a retreat to talk about that. Those criteria are what should drive the screening process, or what should drive the interview process. Every interview question should be based on those criteria. Those criteria should include diversity, equity, and inclusion. But by all being on the same page, what that does is it allows us to focus in on those criteria and not be swayed by what I like to call these extra bells and whistles, things that might appear shiny and exciting, but in the end, not actually impact somebody's ability to do the job any better than anyone else. I'm going to give you an example of what I'm talking about here. I used to work at an independent school in Chicago. I was the DEI director, and it was a school where the student body was diversifying much more quickly than the faculty. There wasn't a lot of teacher turnover. And there was this rare opening in the middle school math department, and the head of the middle school was like, great, this is an opportunity for us to bring in somebody who helps our faculty more closely mirror the diversity of our student body. He had two finalists. One was a white math teacher and one was a math teacher of color. And what he said to me was, Dina, in the end, I couldn't not hire the white math teacher. The math teacher of color had everything we were looking for. Fantastic sample lesson, connected with the students, went on and on and on about how great this candidate was. The white math teacher had all of those same exact things, plus a master's degree in math education, plus 3 extra years of teaching math in China. What he started doing was naming things that to me felt like extra bells and whistles. Because my question to him was, okay, but do you need a math degree or a master's degree in secondary education, math education, in order to effectively teach middle school math? If the answer is yes, then have that be part of the criteria you're looking for in all of your candidates. If the answer is no, I'm not saying disregard that information. I'm simply saying take it into consideration within the context of what else you're looking for when you're making your hire. And the other thing we have to remind ourselves is who it is who tends to have access to these extra bells and whistles. Because somebody who has a master's degree in math education is probably not still paying off their undergraduate student loans. Somebody who's spending a number of years traveling in China is probably not financially supporting a family, and so on. The name of a college or university is another extra bell and whistle. We can all think of a whole host of reasons why somebody might have chosen to attend a college that maybe you've never heard of over one that maybe you have, right? Maybe they got a great financial aid package. Maybe it was closer to home that was important to them at the time, and so on. And then the other thing I really want to emphasize that I hope we can do together, if not for this search, perhaps as a district, because I've been in searches before where I've been told we really want to look for people who are the best fit. And when we use that word, we've got to define, what does that mean? What does it mean for somebody to be a good fit? If we don't define that word together, we're still going to use that word, but now it becomes code for, is this person culturally like me? I'm sure you can think of instances when you've heard somebody say, that person just wasn't a great fit. And when that happens, we've got to ask ourselves, what does that mean? At Amherst, I served on the search for our executive chef. I thought I was going to get to try all the food of the different candidates. Turns out, sadly for me, that was not part of the process. But at the beginning of the process, I asked the head of the search committee, what does it mean for somebody to be a good fit for this role? And he listed all these different things. This person's got to be able to delegate really well. They've got to be open to feedback from all sides. They've got to be able to bring together disparate voices and so on. And then at the end of the process, we had a finalist we were interested in, and the head of the search committee said, so what do you all think about fit for this candidate? And I was able to open up my notebook and say, well, you define fit as A, B, C, D, E. We've already said this candidate checks all those boxes. and we could interview for fit. Because if somebody's got to be a strong delegator, then you can ask the interview question. Tell us about your experience delegating. How did you keep track of details without micromanaging, or however we wanted to ask the question. I've been doing a lot of talking. I'm going to, in a moment, talk about rubrics as a tool to do all the things on the screen, but I want to pause and just see if anybody has any questions. Okay, so let's talk about rubrics, because
I guess
a
I do
rubric-
have a quick question.
Oh, great, Kaya.
Sorry, yeah.
That's okay.
How do you, if you interview finalists and they are all a good fit, they meet all of the requirements, then how do you choose?
Oh, what a great question that leads us into this very slide, because we're going to set criteria that are both about candidates being a good fit and about what their experiences are. And we're not just going to name the criteria, we're going to define that criteria. So you'll see the first, this is just a random sample, you'll see the first criteria here, it says leadership. Well, if we just said, hey, we need somebody who's a good leader, and then we all went off and read candidate materials or interviewed candidates, in our minds, we probably have 10 different definitions of what strong leadership looks like. So what we've got to do, and what we're going to do tomorrow, is say, okay, so what does strong leadership look like within the context of this particular role? And how are we looking to see that articulated? Yeah, Mike. Oh, sorry. Before we go to Mike, does that help, Kaya? Or, I mean, the reality is, if we have candidates who all check every box equally, then we've got to decide what are our priorities as a district. But the reality is, we have 4 candidates. They're not all going to check every box equally. And one of the things we're going to talk about tomorrow is which of our priorities are higher on our list. Okay, Mike. Sorry, we're in like an actual meeting, members dying.
That's okay. Yeah, I've been thinking about this stuff a lot. Not to merge all of our identities, but you know, I'm involved in a search at our shared workplace, Dina, right now, and I'm thinking a lot about what fit means. And I've been trying to think about. I'm thinking about like a similar problem I'm running into in conceptualizing both searches, which is there is a little bit lack of clarity about what the culture is, and also what the culture allows and what the culture wants to be. And deciding between, you know, there's different fits for different things, but you know, there's a multitude of factors that come into play, right? So like we haven't talked about goals for the district. We haven't talked about what our priorities are. Like a lot of that would inform we're going to, and like this other search, I'm like, well, you haven't really decided what you want the office to do, so it's hard to say what the, you know, like it's like this chicken or the egg problem that I feel like people run into. And I don't know that, like, so like the way I see it, like fit often ends up being like, well, it depends. If you see this person as going to do X thing, then fit might look like this. If you think fit looks like Y, well, you know, and there's often not agreement.
Yeah, so first, side note, every single person on your search committee at Amherst College should have taken a presentation with me on this very topic. And so you should be able to bring this up, because everybody has heard me say that very thing about fit and defining fit. So you can say, hey, remember what Dina said, and we need to define fit together. And if the job isn't defined, please come talk to me, because that's got to be defined before you can actually find candidates. But let's talk about this particular instance, because yeah, there may be competing priorities, and there are going to be competing priorities. One of the things that I'm doing to help us prepare for tomorrow is Liz shared with me some of the feedback from the survey for the district of what folks are saying they want in a superintendent, and what folks are saying so far at the focus groups, so that I can put together like a skeleton rubric for us to then use to as a starting point, as a jumping off point, to say, yes, that's really good, or no, this thing is missing, or we need to redefine this, but like just a jumping off point. And what our job is to define what is the job that's ahead. Not really, like that's the job of the superintendent is pretty well defined, right? But what are the skills and abilities that somebody needs? They've got to be good at communicating. They've got to be good at working with unions. They've got to understand open meeting law and bargaining, collective bargaining, and all of these things, right? We know that there are certain things that they need to be able to do and understand in order to do the job well. And tomorrow, what we're going to use, we're going to talk about what are those things? What are the things our community is saying they want to see? And how do we develop a rubric that names those criteria, that defines those criteria, so that we can develop interview questions based off of them, so that we're on the same page about what we're looking for. And here's the reality. There's 10 of us. We're rarely on the same page all the time about everything, but we're going to do our best to figure out a rubric that is going to get as close as possible to what it is we are looking for in a superintendent. And that includes, like, so when we talk about culture, we've had experience with our constituents. We've had experiences hearing from the culture of the schools, what's needed right now in terms of communication and communication transparency, what's needed in terms of, like, these are some of the softer things that aren't going to be listed in those superintendent rubrics that come from MASC, but that we can say, hey, not only do they need to be able to do collective bargaining and know how to do a budget and all the things that superintendents have to do, but we're going to say, in order for them to be a good fit within our district, they're going to need to, and we're going to fill in the blanks, right? They're going to need to be able to communicate across a very diverse community. They're going to need to be able to express to folks that they have been heard and that those voices are a part of the decision-making process. Whatever it is we decide, those are the things that we're going to say, to be a good fit, this is what we're looking for in this role. Does that help?
I mean, it helps a lot. I guess where I still struggle is with this question of culture. And you got at it in some regards, but if one of the criticisms that I became aware of in the phrase that I didn't know before I joined the school committee was this idea of a fortress mentality and a sort of managerial culture mentality that does certain things. Whether or not that is the culture we have is debatable, but like, what is the culture we want to build, and what do we need in a leader to build that? And that's a conversation, I think. I don't know if that goes to the goals conversation, but like, what is the actual culture of the workforce and how we're going to bring about the mission that we need? And then, like our last superintendent likes to talk about service leadership. Is that something that we want? And what does that mean? And like, what does that mean for our culture, right? Like, so I think beyond like the very, like what you put, like, providing the very clear roles and responsibilities that they have to do, and the types of communication we want them to have, what sort of leader do we want for the district is like imbued necessarily with this larger cultural question. And
Yeah,
I don't know when we have that conversation or how we even know,
right,
as 10 people of the school committee, what it is.
Sure. So absolutely, that's 100% right. And I think tomorrow we're not going to be able to set our entire vision for the district or all of the goals for the district, but I hope we'll come with our hopes and our dreams for what our district could be, and use those to inform this notion of fit and this notion of what are the criteria we're looking for. And it's tricky because, to your chicken and egg comment, yes, it would be really, like, this isn't really, like, to me, it's clear that we should have that vision before we get into talking about fit. So it's like not chicken and egg, really. It's like there's a clear thing that should come ahead. And we find ourselves on March 14th, whatever it is today, knowing that we're facing our first two candidates on Monday. And so in the time that we have, we've got to do the best we can. And that means we're having this conversation. And then the next conversation is going to be, so what do we want? And I hope that we can all bring those ideas so that we land at a place that we feel really good about as we're thinking about, okay, so then what are the attributes that we're looking for? I'm gonna stop this conversation here because we could talk about this for the rest of the night, but I do want us, just looking at the clock, to keep on moving here. So tomorrow we're gonna develop a rubric, and there are a few things that are important for rubrics. Again, as I said, not just listing the criteria, but defining the criteria. So we're all on the same page about what this means. And a quick note here, this is the pause when we talk about screening versus interviewing. There should be two rubrics. There should be a screening rubric and then an interview rubric. So tomorrow we're going to do the interview rubric, but the search committee did a screening rubric, and the criteria for a screening rubric initially need to come straight out of the job description. So this is where we go back to the importance of writing a strong job description. And the reason for that is when I'm applying to jobs, I'm going to read the job description, and then I'm going to write my cover letter, my resume, based on what that job description says the folks are looking for. If we're actually looking for something when we're reading their materials that's not listed in the job description, what we're going to end up doing is actually giving people extra points for happening to read our minds and docking points from people who don't happen to read our minds. If we're saying, I want to see in their resume, I once was working with somebody and said, hey, how come this candidate didn't move on to your next round? And they said, they didn't mention anything in their cover letter or resume about working collaboratively. And I looked at the job description. I said, okay, but job description doesn't actually say anything about you wanting to hear about people's experience working collaboratively. And the person said, well, everybody in this field knows you've got to be able to work collaboratively if you're going to be successful. And that's where our bias kicks in, right? Because we've got to ask ourselves, well, who might not know? And why would I assume that everybody would know something that I didn't explicitly say? So when it comes to screening, that's one important consideration. When it comes to interviewing, we can pick the criteria we'd like. And we want to ensure that those criteria are now what are going to allow us to frame our interview questions. So, I just got ahead of myself here. One of the things we'll do is we'll also define our rating scale. I've been on searches where we had a 5-point scale and the numbers weren't defined, and we all went off, we read our materials, we came back, one person said, I didn't give anybody a 5 because nobody's perfect. And somebody else said, I didn't give anybody 1 because that's just mean. And now our 5-point scale has gone out the window. So having a clearly defined criteria is one of the things we'll work on tomorrow as well. And rating scale. And one of the things that we want to ensure, and we'll make sure of this as well, is that DEI is a part of the interview very explicitly. But let's talk about interview processes or practices that mitigate bias. So number one, using our rubric to frame our questions is important. So gone are questions like, where do you see yourself in 5 years? Or what's your greatest strength or greatest area of growth? Or what are you most proud of in your career? Or what are you least proud of, right? Like these questions don't tell us, is this person gonna do this job well? They tell us, does this person know how to interview well? I can tell you till I'm blue in the face, I just care about my work so much, I have trouble putting it down. Right? That's what my weakness is. That's not true. I have all sorts of weaknesses, but I've learned how to answer that question in an interview type setting to make a weakness sound like a strength. And when we're looking at mitigating bias and ensuring that we're hiring folks who have the best abilities to do the job, not just to interview well, making sure our questions really are aligned to our rubric is really important. We also are going to want to ensure that we are asking the same questions of all candidates, asked in the same order, ideally asked by the same person each time. For us, this is a little tricky because we have 2 candidates going on Monday, and then we have 2 candidates going on Thursday. And so that puts, if we ask all the candidates the same questions, that puts our Thursday candidates in an advantage because they could watch the Monday interviews and then be like, oh, I know what I'm going to be asked. So we can talk about how we want to approach this tomorrow when we meet. But one thing we might want to think about doing is giving our interview questions to our Monday candidates a few days ahead of time. That way, everybody's on the same page And the reality is, I don't know about you, but I want people to really be able to give us thoughtful answers. And maybe there will be a few things that we ask them because we want to see how they think on their feet. But I don't know, something we can talk about. But that's one of the best practices in terms of mitigating bias. When I was trained as an interviewer, I was told the best, the best interviews are the ones that get off script. We connect about something and now we're having more of a conversation. What we know now is that that's how we end up with people just like us, because we connect on something that we have in common. And you worked with this person, I worked with this person, you really have an interest in this, me too. And so we come away feeling really warm and fuzzy about people because they remind us of ourselves. So keeping our interviews really scripted is going to be important. And that doesn't mean, though, that we can't ask follow-up questions. Absolutely, we can do that. I have such a tickle in my throat. I'm going to mute myself for just a moment while I cough. Just a moment. Sorry. So what we want to do in the end is be able to compare apples to apples. So if we have a candidate who answers like a fourth of our question with a fourth of the information that we feel like we need in order to really assess, let's pause and let's say, hang on, I just want to be able to ask a follow-up question, because what we want to do is be able to come away with all of the information we need in order to be able to assess the candidates. Mike.
Just one quick question on that. Like, I know in the last time we did this, I don't know, maybe we didn't even talk about it, but I was under the impression that we weren't allowed to ask specific follow-up questions because we have to ask everyone the same. Like, do you know if that's true in our situation or not?
It's not true. We didn't
Awesome.
ask follow-up questions, but I think we absolutely could have. And again, the idea is that perhaps some candidates need to hear a question reframed or phrased in a different way, or perhaps that we've decided we're looking to learn about X, and so we're going to ask this question, and it's like, oh gosh, we didn't actually learn about X. So let's follow up, because if we learned about X from everybody else, it could mean that this candidate doesn't know about X, or it could mean we didn't ask the question in a way that registered with the candidate that we wanted to hear about X. Aileen.
Yeah, this thought that I have may be actually way back part of the fit discussion, and we could put it off to another night or another time, but it's something that I wonder about, and that is the subjectivity of like style that appeals to somebody. That, you know, I might really especially enjoy being around, or think a good leader is somebody who's, you know, super outgoing and cheerful. And somebody else might think that, you know, and like the resume being equal every other way. Somebody else might think they're too perky. I want a business-like person as a superintendent, but everything else, you know what I mean? And that can't be on a job description,
Right.
really, but to me that it strikes me as part of a fit thing of
Yeah.
you know, what kind of people do I like to be around, but we're not looking for our best friend.
Right, exactly. So there are a few things here that you said that I want to address. Thank you. It's a really great question. So this is a little bit about fit. It's also a little bit about bias, right? It's a little bit about like who feels most comfortable to me, given my identities, my experiences, how this person is speaking, the way they're articulating their words, you know, are they warm? Are they perky? Like all of those things. And that's why it's especially important for us to name all of the qualities that we're looking for. Because if we're saying we want somebody who's really going to be able to connect across diverse constituents, across a diverse community, then we want to make sure we're asking questions about that. Tell us about times that you have connected, right? However, we just choose to word these questions. Tell us your experiences. Give us stories about times that you did this, so that we can then say to ourselves, gosh, you know, this person came across very businesslike and not very warm, and yet that's my judgment. And I need to recognize that as my judgment. And I need to go back to the data that this person gave me, or the data that we collect when we do our site visits about how does this person engage with multiple constituents or whatever, right? I'm just using this as an example. And use that data to inform, okay, I'm going to pause my own assumption here that somebody's got to be perky in order to be able to relate to people, or that perkiness means they're not going to do it, whatever it is, right? I'm going to pause that assumption that I have. I'm going to recognize that that's an assumption that I have. I'm going to recognize that that's something maybe I like or I'm looking for in terms of personality. I'm going to put that stuff aside because I'm going to focus on these skills and abilities that we all have said these are important for somebody to be able to do the job well. And if this person has told us stories that demonstrate they're doing it well, and we've heard from their districts that, yep, they do this thing really well, then that gives me extra reason to put my own personal preferences aside about who I like or who feels warm and fuzzy to me, and I'm going to focus on those criteria. And that's one of the hardest things, and that's why we're having this conversation right now, is to be able to recognize in ourselves, what are we looking for, and then ask ourselves, right, along the way, I'm really liking what the way this person is talking. Is that because they're speaking in the same way I am because we share a racial identity? Is it because they're actually saying content that I am looking for? And by asking those questions of ourselves, we can try and pinpoint what is it that's personal preference? What is it that's really about content, skills, and abilities?
Thanks a lot. That's real helpful.
Great. All right, let's keep moving. Okay, again, I'm getting ahead of myself here. I don't think we're going to have a lot of opportunity for informal conversation, although Liz did mention that there might be the possibility of folks taking candidates out for lunch. And I just want to caution us against that practice, because that is when those kinds of unscripted conversations make it really hard to mitigate bias. It makes it really hard to standardize the process, makes it really hard to make sure we're getting the same kind of information that we need from each candidate. Those can be really great opportunities for us to tell the candidate about the district, for us to tell the candidate about like the process and set them up for success for the process. So I'm not necessarily saying we shouldn't do that. But we should really talk about whether that's something we want to do, and if so, how we want to use that time. And my recommendation would be that we not use that time in any kind of a way to come to any conclusions about the candidates. Because again, there might be some candidates who are better at schmoozing. There might be some of us who tend to go off into this direction. And now, hey, we're having this really in-depth conversation about standards-based grading. And we're coming away with that being informed about this particular candidate, but we didn't get to have that conversation with these other candidates. And that makes it really hard to think about an inclusive. More on that, I think, tomorrow, probably. I think we're going to talk about questions to avoid at the end. But this is really for not us, but this is for future practices where really we're thinking about the composition of the search committee, that it's representational, that it's diverse, and that we're sending messages about what we aspire to as a district through the questions we ask and through the things that we talk about. So again, I'm not going to go into detail with this, although it could inform us a bit as we're coming up with our questions. But all right, so I want to switch gears just a bit here and jump back to thinking about managing and recognizing bias. Before I do that, though, I should go back. Questions? Any other questions about like the actual process, which again, we can talk more about.
Sardine, it's not a question, but I've got a sick little one I got to go take care of. So I'm sorry I have to go. He was waiting for 8. I told him 8.
Sorry, sick
I
little one.
apologize.
This is being recorded, so maybe you can watch this recording before tomorrow.
That would be great. Thank you.
Sure. We should be able to, with no other questions, get through in about 10 more minutes for those of you who are watching the clock. So again, we want to design a process to take bias out to the greatest extent possible, but we still bring ourselves. So there are a few things that we can do. One is to raise our awareness of our own personal biases. We've talked about this a little bit, but how many of you have ever taken an implicit association test? Okay, so a few of us, maybe, if you remember. So these are free. I'll share this PowerPoint with you so that you've got this link. And they take like 5 to 10 minutes each. You can take as many as you want. It's a really great way to get a sense of what are some of our biases. You can take one on race, you can take one on gender, you can take one on, you used to be able to take one on Donald Trump in case you weren't sure where you stood. But there are all sorts of tests that you can take to just get a sense of what your inclinations are. I once took one of these tests. I think I maybe mentioned this at some point. I learned that I am biased towards older people. Apparently, I like older people more than I like younger people. And actually found myself in an interview with a candidate shortly thereafter, like trying to give extra points to this candidate and being like, oh, what a great response, which is patronizing and not helpful at all. And then I was interviewing a 22-year-old for a position, and the person said, oh, I have so much experience in this. And I remember internally rolling my eyes and being like, yeah, right, 22-year-old, why don't you tell me about all your experience? And both times I had to stop myself and be like, hey, that's your bias, knock it off, and push myself to really focus on what they were saying. So the more we know what our biases might be, the more we can be on the lookout. It doesn't mean we're going to stop them. It's just we can recognize it a little bit more readily when they're at play. And there's actually data that shows that if you take one of these tests shortly before doing an interview, doesn't matter which test you do, it just reminds us that bias is a thing, and we're less likely to rely on our biases when we're doing the interview. Another thing we can do is practice constructive uncertainty. This isn't something that we're guided to do very frequently in our culture. We're told we're supposed to be experts. We know about things, but if we think about all those images, the anchoring bias, the confirmation bias, we learned that the more we tell ourselves, I don't know, and I'm going to let this candidate tell me, the more likely we are to get the information we truly need to make a decision. We could talk another time about redacting identifying information, because that can really help mitigate bias in the screening process, but not something that I think we're doing as a district right now. Being on the lookout for triggers of bias is another thing to help mitigate bias. Again, not because we can stop these triggers, it's just remembering like, oh, this thing is happening, so I have to be careful that bias might be impacting me. So having ambiguous evidence. We like to think that we know things. So if there's ambiguous evidence, we tend to fill in the gaps. If there's emotional overload, if you just spent the entire day at the vet with your cat, your mind is on your cat and you're thinking, oh gosh, I hope the cat's okay. And that means that we're filling in a lot of those other gaps ourselves because our whole brain isn't really there with us. I use that as an example of GL all the time, not just with you, but like I have cats too, as you know. So fear of threat is an interesting one. Cognitive overload, I skipped that, but like we're making a big decision with a lot of information in a short amount of time. Fear of threat, though, I think is an important one. I do workshops on bias with police officers, and obviously like fear of threat is very different for them because their lives might be at stake when they're going into certain situations. We have fear of threat too, even if our lives aren't at stake. We are making big decisions in front of a whole lot of people that can feel threatening, that can feel hard, and that can be a trigger for bias. Short on time, we make quicker decisions informed by our biases. So slowing down, giving ourselves time, or again, recognizing, hey, I don't have a lot of time, so I've really got to be on the lookout for my bias. And then we pause. This actually has an E on the end, but I didn't like the E, so I took it off. So we pause. We pay attention to what's happening beneath our judgments and assessments. We acknowledge our own interpretations, judgments, assessments, understand other possible ways of interpreting a situation, search for the most empowering way to do so. I'll tell you another story. I was once in an interview with a candidate, and right off the bat, I was like, nope, wrong candidate. This isn't the person for this job. And about halfway through the interview, it dawned on me that the way this candidate was speaking and the way, like the intonation of her voice and the way she was articulating her words, it was exactly the same as one of my wife's family members, who I'm not going to name right now because this is being recorded. And if any of you are watching this, you're all lovely people, and I'm sure it's not you that I'm talking about. But as soon as I realized that this was happening, it's like I put my finger on this. I was like, this fog cleared. And I realized I hadn't even been listening to what the candidate was saying. I was so focused on my negative visceral reaction to this in-law of mine. And so I needed to pause, right? I need to say, why am I having this feeling about this candidate? It has nothing to do with them and everything to do with me. So how do I get rid of that and focus on what's going on? A few last thoughts on bias. I think we all know that, so bias is a thing. It's going to impact all of us. We can raise our awareness. We can try and mitigate bias. We are going to be impacted by the identities we hold, by the lenses that we bring. And the more we can talk about this openly with each other in a way that brings grace and understanding, the more we're going to be able to come to a better conclusion about our decision. And so if we can find ways to talk about, hey, might bias be at play here, the more we'll be able to really come to a strong decision. But we've got to find a way to do that in ways that, as I said, hold each other in grace, remember our humanity, and allow us to really engage and not blame each other or not feel blame. I've been in a number of interviews where people have said, hey, I don't know about this candidate. And we've paused and we said, how might bias be a factor here? GL, I see you unmuted.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, having this conversation in a public meeting is, I would imagine, makes this so much harder, right? So do you have any tips on how we can, make notice of that in a way that feels safe for all of us?
It's a really great question that I wonder if we should talk about tomorrow, because I could talk about what might feel safe for me, but I think what might feel safe for other people might be different. I can talk about ways I've had the conversation. I think one of the things that I hope is that now that we've had this conversation on bias, future conversations on bias might feel a little less scary, or might feel a little less like you're attacking me, and more like, oh, right, you're reminding me that bias might be a thing. Is it a thing? Let me think about this. So I think part of it is just giving ourselves permission to say, like, yeah, bias could be impacting me here. And how we bring it up for each other, maybe we talk about that tomorrow. I don't know, what do others think? I'm seeing some nods. It's a really good question. And yeah, having these conversations in open meeting, it does make it a little more loaded and challenging, or it can. Emily.
I'm just going to voice that another piece of that challenge is that so much of hiring involves decisions that can potentially lead to like legal liability.
Thank you for that, because that is this slide. So wonderful. I'll pay you the $20 later for transitioning us so nicely. So we can talk about, hey, I'm worried that bias might be at play here. We can ask questions about, like, hey, tell us about your experiences creating inclusive cultures for diverse communities. Like we can ask all sorts of questions about DEI. We can talk about all sorts of things about diversity, equity, and inclusion, but we can't actually talk specifically about these things, nor can we ask candidates questions about them. So we can say though, so I'm going to give you an example. I was in an interview where we had a really strong candidate. At the end of every one of her responses to our questions, she would say, did I answer your question? I'm not sure I got everything. Did I get everything? And at the end, we said, thank you, and we hung up. And one of the people on the search committee said, no way, our students are going to eat this person alive. We need somebody who's far more competent. And so we paused and we said, could bias be a factor here? Let's talk about how some of the identities that this candidate might hold might have impacted the way that they were socialized to be in a space, to maybe not be the smartest person in the room, or to maybe qualify really fantastic answers with, I'm gonna leave space for that to not be the best answer possible. And so we could have a conversation about maybe bias was impacting us in that moment without saying this person is a woman or talking about her gender identity specifically. And so I think one of the things that we'll need to do is find ways to say, okay, could bias be a factor here? It might be that candidates name their racial identities. We can say legally, if somebody has talked about the racial identity, we can say, I think, without getting into muddy waters, hey, I just want to make sure bias isn't a factor here in this because this person said this was their identity, right? That's different from saying, ooh, I think because of this identity of this candidate, they're not going to be able to do X or they're going to do this, right? So I think in talking about bias and the potential for bias, I think that's a little different from actually talking about a candidate's identities in our decision-making process. If that makes sense. And I will say that, like, if a candidate brings up one of these topics on their own, not then an invitation for us to dig deeper and ask them more questions about that. We don't want to ask any questions about any of these things. Sometimes we do it without realizing it. You went to that college, me too. What year did you graduate? Well, now I just accidentally asked somebody their age. Or I was hiring somebody and I was like, no way is this person going to take this job at this salary. So I called them up and I told them the salary and they're like, oof, yeah, that's a lot lower than my current salary. And I started to say, what's your current salary? Because I just want to know, like, how far off was I and could I maybe get there? And I stopped myself halfway through the question. I was like, what's your goal? Don't answer that question. That's illegal. What's the salary need to be in order for you to feel valued and respected in doing this job? That's a legal question that I can ask. So one of the things that we'll want to think about is, yes, let's remember this slide and not ask questions about these things, not bring these things up about the candidates. Okay, what other questions do folks have either about this or anything else? Okay, that is the end of my presentation. My hope is that we can use this information and these concepts to create a really robust rubric that's going to then allow us to create really dynamic, amazing interview questions, and that's going to guide our process in a way that allows us to mitigate bias, but also create a really sound process. Any other questions, thoughts? Right. Thank you for your questions and thank you for being here for this.
Thank you, Dina, for doing this. This is a
Thank
really
you.
good
It's excellent.
Yeah.
It was really informative.
Dina, I have one quick last question. I actually watched the video that you shared last year.
Well, I hope I didn't tell all the same jokes.
You did. But you also shared a lot of the resources, and it wasn't dissimilar from this, and I really did appreciate it. And I think on that you had a lot of links into the little tests that you can take. And I wonder if you can share that again with the committee so we can access it if we need to.
The video, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can. I think I still have the link to that video. So I will send Annie the link to that video, and it will be a little different, and it will go into like more about the job description and more about networking and things like that. But I'll share the link to that video and then the link to this I'll share this presentation so you all have it.
Thank you. Thanks for your time.
Okay, thank you, really, truly, Dina. And I mean, I guess I don't have a question, but I mean, it's comforting that you will be there to sort of guide us. I'm wondering is there a way that if you see us straying into territory, you could signal us? Trying to figure out like what's the best way for
I'll do
you to
that.
try and guide us that wouldn't, create its own sort of bias in the process.
Yeah. I absolutely can do that. And I also know that you all bring a lot of experience and wealth of knowledge as well. So I hope we can like steer each other. But yeah, absolutely. If it's like, ooh, we're going towards a thing, I can either make Holly's face or just like say like, oh, let's pause for a moment.
Okay. Great, thank you. All right, if there isn't anything further, then we need a motion to adjourn.
I'll make a motion to adjourn, and it has a rider that's an awesome hat, Mayor.
Thank you.
And Dina, your $20 to me needs to come in the form of a donation to the schools, and I will give you 2 pieces of pie. I don't know if you saw my Facebook post about the pie day that was canceled tonight, and I had baked 2 apple pies for Pie Day. Gwen has already committed to getting one of them and donating to the schools. So if you want 2 pieces of pie, $20.
Pie's my favorite. I do want 2 pieces of pie.
Does that mean that you're seconding my motion?
Sure, second the motion.
Okay.
Take Venmo.
Roll call please on adjourning and whatever negotiation just happened right there.
Member Robbins,
Yes.
Member Gazy,
Yes.
Member Seraphy Cox,
Yes.
Member Stein. Oh, he's gone. Member Levy,
Yes.
Member Goldman,
Yes.
Member Davis,
Yes.
and Mayor Shara.
Yes. All right. See you all tomorrow. Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Dina.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
everybody.